So we're going to be in Acts 13. Acts 13. We're going to be in verses 13 through 15 this morning. I'm going to tell you why we're in such a short section of Scripture this morning. As you can see, this section of Scripture is from verse 13 all the way to verse 52. And what it is Paul is actually going to be speaking in the synagogue, and he's going to be talking about Christ. And he has this long sermon that we're going to be tackling in the next couple of weeks. But before we do, there's a brief section in here about Paul and Barnabas and this man named John Mark. And when they set out on their journey, they're going to go to Antioch in Pisidia. And when they are starting this journey, something happens. And I want to read it for you. And it's very brief, and when you look at it, you're like, that doesn't mean anything. We'll get into that just a little bit. It says, "Now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. And John left them and returned to Jerusalem. But they went on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia. And on the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down. After the reading from the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent a message to them saying, 'Brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, say it.'" And then what we're going to be looking at next week and the following is Paul's sermon. Basically, think about it this way. Each and every one of you were to walk in this morning, and I were to walk up here and I just picked you out. If I was to look and I said, "Bill, come up here, come preach a sermon right now." He's ready to go back there. I'm like, "Dennis, come on up here, you're ready to go." Just as soon as you walked in, how many of you would be like, "I don't think that they're ready, that they've actually got an outline together or anything. I think they just have to come wing it." Well, that's kind of what Paul's going to have to do. He's just told by one of the rulers of the synagogue, they're like, "Hey, come speak to us, some words of encouragement." And so Paul just gets up there and he witnesses. And what we're going to see in this aspect, what we're going to talk about this morning, is that when you follow God, when I follow God, when you follow God, when people in your lives follow God, there are opportunities that come your way. And a lot of times you'll see that opportunity come out into a witnessing event that you never thought possible. And it only happens by you following God. You can't make it happen. It just happens by following God. And I just want to give you a little story about what happens when you follow. That what happens of opportunities coming. I might have read this story to you before, but it's a lady named S.I. McMillan, S.I. McMillan in his book, None of These Diseases, tells a story of a young woman who wanted to go to college. But her heart sank when she read the question on the application blank that asked, "Are you a leader?" Being both honest and conscientious, she wrote no, and returned the application expecting the worst. To her surprise, she received this letter from the college. "Dear applicant, a study of the application forms reveals that this year our college will have 1,452 new leaders. We are accepting you because we feel it is imperative that they have at least one follower." Think about that for a moment. She was the only one that was willing to be a follower. Everyone else wanted to be the leader, the man, or the woman. They wanted to be the it, but nobody wanted to follow. And her opportunity to go to college happened because she was willing to follow. And in our lives, when we are willing to follow God, opportunities happen. And it's not opportunities that we make for ourselves. It's opportunities that happen from simply doing what God tells us to do. And it happens in the most unexpected ways. But there's one thing that I want to point out to you of following God. Don't quit. Don't quit following God. Because in verse 13, I'm going to read it for you again. I didn't understand this until I went to seminary, and a teacher brought this out for us and explained what's actually happening in verse 13. And I'm going to read it for you again. It says, "Now Paul and his companions," his companion would have been Barnabas. "Now Paul and his companions," and John Mark, "set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem." Now, why did he leave? It's a very short little section, and almost, if you're reading through it, you're probably going, that doesn't make a difference. I mean, he just returned to Jerusalem. What's going on? Well, here's a couple of things that people think of what happened. Some think that John Mark was intimidated by the prospect of the arduous and dangerous task of crossing the Taurus Mountains to reach Antioch. Some think that he was angered that Paul was assuming more and more authority and forcing his cousin Barnabas to take a lesser role. Some even say that he had malaria in the Pamphylian lowlands. And then others think that he disagreed with Paul's concept of a law-free mission to the Gentiles. And you might be going, well, that doesn't really make a difference. Well, if you went into Acts chapter 15, when John Mark comes back and says, hey, I want to actually go with you guys, Paul vehemently disagrees. So much so that Barnabas and Paul forever split. And they go to separate mission journeys because Paul was so upset from John Mark leaving them. And in this very short section of Scripture, we see the first time, or one of the first times in Paul's ministry, that when he's following God, the person who was supposed to be right by his side, the person that was supposed to be helping him, that was supposed to be just another one that he could trust, walked away. And in our lives, that happens so often, right? And it hurts deeply when those that we love, those that we care about, those that are friends, those that are supposed to be right by our side, they just one day, they leave. And you feel like, I'm following God. I really and truly feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Why did this person who was supposed to be right next to me walk away? And the stories can be just like what happened with Paul. It could have been that he got sick. It could be that they got sick. It could be that they disagreed. It could be that they just felt like, you know what, I want to go do something else. But the fact is that they left. And when we follow God, there will be people, sometimes our closest loved ones, that will quit on us. And it will be incredibly painful. So when we see that in our lives, we're going to see next in just a few moments of what we're actually supposed to do when those closest to us quit on us. But here's the next point that I want to bring out, is that they may quit, you don't quit. You don't quit. Because when they get into this missionary journey, they're about to go all over the world. They've already started to go. And when it talks about the areas that they've gone, some have estimated that they've gone over 100 miles. Then they're talking about a 12-mile hike that they would have to go through. Paul himself, they think he actually got malaria on this trip. And so, I mean, they're going through some of the most intense time of their lives. And Paul doesn't quit. He keeps on going. And in our lives, we're so often tempted with that we have people in our lives that we go, you know what? I disagree with them. I completely disagree with them, and they anger me. And so we go, you know what? I'm not going to follow them anymore. I'm not going to be with them anymore. Or sometimes we get jealous. I mean, I might be the only person here who gets jealous, but I'm saying that I do get jealous. Some of you might. But I get jealous of other people. And I go, you know what? I don't want to be around them because they got nicer things than I do. They get to go do better things than I do. You know what? I'm just going to go over here and not hang around them because I don't really like them because they have what I want. The same thing could have happened with John Mark. His cousin was Barnabas. And so when John Mark was told, hey, come with us on this missionary journey, come with us, it would have been Barnabas, his cousin. Come on with us. And if John Mark's a young man like myself or like every one of us in this room, we're all still young, and we are going out on these missionary journeys, we might have a little bit of ambition. You know, I could be the second in command. I could be one of the next leaders of this group. And then it comes to find out, nope, you're just going to be a follower. That reality can make some of us quit. Sometimes when life doesn't happen the way we expect it or the way we want it to, We just go, you know what? I'm not going to get higher up. I'm not going to get these special things. You know what? I'm just going to quit. Or sometimes the people in our lives that are supposed to be helping us, whether it's in a difficult circumstance, whether a loved one is sick, and we see them act in a way that makes us angry, that makes us upset, that sometimes we just say, you know what, I'm just going to walk away. Well, here's the thing. Don't quit. Don't walk away. And the reason why is because God called you to where you are. God called you to follow Him to that situation. God called you to follow. And this is what we see in verses 14 through the following. We'll pick it up. But they, that would have been Paul, that would have been Barnabas, that would have been everybody else except for John Mark, they went on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia. And on the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and sat down. After the reading from the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent a message to them saying, brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, say it. How hard do you think that statement would have been? Here it is, you've just lost one of your closest friends, your closest people who are supposed to be right by your side, helping you do what you feel like God's called you to do, and they just walked away from you. The pain and the betrayal of that, and then all of a sudden, you come sit down in church and somebody says, hey, come serve with us. Hey, come do this thing. That's the last thing that you want to do, right? It's the last thing is when someone that you love has walked away. But when you see with Paul and Barnabas, they continue their custom. You notice they went into the synagogue and they sat down. And you know, when you read that, it's like, okay, that doesn't really make a big difference. Well, that was the very thing that they would do on all of their missionary journeys, is that Paul would always say to the Jews first and also the Greeks. So they would go to the synagogue first. And so what we see happen is when Paul faces his loved one, his friend, walking away, somebody who was supposed to help him, the very next thing he does is he continues to follow God. He doesn't quit. He continues to do exactly what he felt God called him to do. And in this area that they're going to, it's one of the biggest metropolitan areas that they could go to. And the very places they go to in this metropolitan area is they go to the synagogue. And the synagogue would have been a place that all of the Jewish community would have gone to. This is the area where when they would talk about things going on, that they would all get together. And so after the synagogue, you know, just like church folk, we all hang around, we talk about what's going on. Well, that's the same thing that happens in this synagogue, is that they're all hanging around, talking around about the things that are going on in life. And so when Paul comes, this is the perfect opportunity to tell others about Christ. And so God is not only leading him through, you know, arduous mountains, through arduous times, but he's leading them to this area of culture. He's leading him, and then when he comes to sit down, the ruler of the synagogue, the person just like me, would have got up there and said, all right, Paul, come up here. Tell us this new thing that you have learned. Tell us what you have seen as you've traveled. And the opportunity happens just like that. And it's because Paul didn't quit. He continued to follow God and to do what he felt like he was called to do. And what happened? God blessed him with an opportunity to speak his name, to speak on his behalf. And when I read that story and thought about that for a moment, and I read the rest of what Paul gets into. I mean, he gets into talking about Christ. He talks about David. He talks about the Old Testament leaders and how they all lead up to Christ. And he's written there just preaching his guts out. And then what we're going to see happen is a beautiful, beautiful reminder of how God changes people, how God brings the results. Even when we want to make things happen, God is the one that saves. And we're going to see that later on. But the thing that is so powerful is that Paul continued to do what the Lord had called him to do. And God blessed him. God blessed his circumstance. Now here's the question. What happened to John Mark? What happened to John Mark? Well, as we're going to see later on in chapter 15, John Mark wants to come back. For some reason, he wants to come back and be a part of this missionary journey again. Sometimes when we quit, we regret that decision. Have you ever been in an experience like that, where you quit something in the middle of it and you were just like, I just can't take this anymore, I'm out, and then you walk away and you're like, I'm done. And then it just eats away at you. You ever been in that situation? I know I have. But it just eats away at you. And you just can't help it. You're like, I wonder what would have happened if I would have just stuck it out. If I would have just continued going. What would have happened? I can imagine that that's what happened with John Mark. And so he goes, you know what? I want to go back out with them. And what we're going to see in Acts 15 is that Barnabas actually says, okay, then come with us. And you're going to see throughout the rest of the Old Testament or the New Testament, you're going to actually see Paul write letters and say, bring back John Mark. Bring John to me. He's been a helper to me. And so sometimes when we quit, sometimes when we think like we have failed miserably, God gives us a second chance. And with John Mark, he gets a second chance. And it's powerful. And the greatest thing about John Mark's life is not what happened on this missionary journey. He wrote this book that sold millions and millions of copies. In fact, it's been on the bestseller list for thousands of years. It's called the Book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament. The very man who, on his first opportunity to be a missionary, to serve God, to tell about Jesus that he had seen, to tell others about, he walked away from God. He walked away from his mission opportunity. He walks away. And I know he must have thought in his own mind, he must have thought, I can never, ever be used again. I can never, ever have a witness again because I walked away from God. I walked away from what he called me to do. But it's so beautiful that God gives second chances. And he gives third chances, and he gives fourth chances, and fifth chances, and sixth chances. You keep on going how many chances he gives. God is gracious. And you know what? He sold millions and millions of copies. That Book of Mark. I remember when our seminary professor told that to all of us. None of us knew that. We were all just reading that like we'd all read it for years. Just John Mark. Who's this John Mark guy? And he goes, he was the one that wrote the Book of Mark. And his very first instance, his very first mission opportunity, he walked away from God. He walked away from what God called him to do. But at the end of his life, we remember him not for this failure. We remember him for the Book of Mark that he wrote. And when I was younger, I knew what God had called me to do. I knew that he had called me to follow him in ministry. I knew what he had called me to do, but I didn't want to do it. I completely walked away and said, you know what, God, I'm going to go do my thing. I'm just going to put you over here. I'm going to go do my thing, and I'm going to live my life. And then, as what will happen for each and every one of us when we do that to God, you'll come to the end of yourself and go, I can't live like this. I have to follow you, God, but I just don't want to. And when I went off to seminary, and I was sitting in that seminary classroom, and that teacher was teaching for weeks and weeks to all these people in that class, and they all wanted to be missionaries, they all wanted to be preachers, they all wanted to be these mission-minded people. And I sat there in that class, and I didn't want to be any of that. I didn't want any of it. I sat there, I was like, I do not want this at all. And I was like, in fact, I've walked away from God. Not once, twice, more than a couple of times. I've walked away from what he has called me to do. And I'll never forget that teacher reading that story of John Mark. And he says, this man walked away. And he looked at him, and he looked at all of us and said, how many of you have ever walked away from what God has called you to do? How many of you have ever felt like what God said for you to do, you walked away? And then he went through how Barnabas and Paul brought him back into the fold although it did cause conflict later on, Paul actually forgives them. And then he goes, and he's not marked by his failure. John Mark is not remembered for walking away. In fact, when we read these set of verses, none of us really know this unless we do some deep study that he actually left because he didn't want to follow them. What we remember about John Mark is the book of Mark. And if any one of you have ever felt like that God has called you to do something, that God has called you to live a certain way, and you go, I made a mistake. I walked away from God at this point in life. I didn't do what he told me to do at this point in life, or that point, or this point. And I can remember so clearly all the times God called me to do something, I've walked away from it. Then you're just like John Mark, and you're just like me, you're just like every single one of us. We have all walked away. We have all quit what God has called us to do. Every single one of us. That's why we have Jesus. Jesus was the only person who never quit. He carries that sin on the cross, and each and every one of us are forgiven for that, for what Jesus went through on the cross. And you know what you're remembered for? You're not remembered for the mistakes. You're not remembered for the time that you said, no, God, I'm not going to follow you. What you're remembered for is what Christ has done. You have a new life, a new calling. So when you are given that opportunity again, when God says, follow me in this circumstance, follow me with your finances, follow me with your relationships, follow me in your community life, follow me in this way. Don't quit. Don't quit. Follow him. And if you have quit, God is a God of second chances, third chances, fourth chances, fifth chances. Keep on counting, and God keeps giving those chances. And God doesn't remember you for your failure. God doesn't remember you for walking away. What God remembers is what he's done for you. So don't quit. Keep following God, and he will keep bringing opportunities to you. He will continue to bring opportunities to you as long as you continue to follow him. You can't make God act. You can't make God bring healing. You can't make God do things. But I'll tell you this, when you follow God, things just start happening. Things all around you start happening, and you can only say, man, it was God that brought it. It wasn't me. It was God. So don't quit. Continue following God. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you so much, Lord, for this story. Lord, every time that I get to talk about this, every time that I see John Mark, Lord, I'm just reminded of me. God, I have walked away from you so many times. God, and there are always those choices to follow you. And I always feel like, God, that I quit. God, but thank you for your forgiveness. Thank you. Thank you that you give us a second chance. God, thank you that you give us a new life. God, I pray for each and every one of us in this room, God, that we won't quit. We won't quit what you have called us to do, God, that we will follow you. God, because when we follow you, things happen. Opportunities happen. Opportunities to tell others about you, God, to be a witness, to be a servant. God, opportunities happen when we follow you. God, please help us not to quit. Please help us to continue following you with all of our life.